Hey everybody, welcome to Paladins University Lecture 3. In this lecture we're going to be talking about the first of the applications, really basic applications of space and resources, which I have sort of named the flow of a fight. And this is probably the most important application of space and resources to understand for the macro game in competitive Paladins. Once you understand the flow, you should understand and be able to analyze the game very well on a macro level. The most important thing to start with when understanding the flow is simply the basic concept that one team will always be better in the neutral game. So if we take a standard game here, the neutral game is essentially when both teams come to point and they both take their sides of the map and they sort of sit there and they shoot each other, right? So red controls just generally this half of the map and then blue controls just generally sort of this half of the map, right? And so depending on the comps in the situation, one team is just sort of naturally going to cap point faster than the other team, and they're naturally just going to gain an advantage if the other team doesn't do anything. So in this situation, red team will just slowly gain advantage because they have like sort of that backliner who just likes to sit there and shoot point, and Nar who likes to stand on point, whereas blue team has like this sort of, you know, off lane, doesn't really like to be around point or burn point. They kind of like to, you know, do things and try to get kills, right? So red team's going to slowly get more and more of an advantage in terms of the cap point, and blue's hand is eventually going to be forced to do something. And so the main thing that they're going to be forced to do is to get some resources from the enemy team in some way, and often this is something like space, right? So we talked a little bit about this in the space lecture, but essentially this blue team wants to, you know, start taking some of red team's space. So maybe, you know, they'll start trying to venture here and take maybe some of this space away from red team so that they have more space than the enemy, which makes it easier for them to cap point and sort of nullifies the advantage that red naturally has based on their team comp. And so often in draft you'll have situations like this, like let's say we're on Bright Marsh here and we have the team with the Ashe and the BK and the team with the NR and the Victor. The team with the Ashe and the BK is going to be like, okay, well, our draft is really good in apps, you know, both these champions play really good in apps, and they have something like a Victor which doesn't play really good in apps, so let's try to, you know, take apps aggressively. That's going to be sort of our game plan, is to play around apps. So then instead of their game plan just being to like play off of point and to sort of try to win the point, their game plan is to take apps. Like that's sort of what they say in draft, you know, we're going to draft for this, then we're going to take apps, and they're going to try to win the game by taking apps. And essentially that, you know, there's an assumption there or something after the point where they think that once they take apps, if they take both apps, then they'll be able to win the point, right? So instead of just winning the point straight off, they are drafting a more aggressive team comp because they want to take some space and then play off point. So then blue team, on the other hand, is essentially the defensive team comp. They're the ones that are going to be wanting mostly to sit back and react to what plays the enemy is making and try to react in a way that allows them to still win the fight. And so we're mostly going to be talking about the defensive team and the options that they have. And really, the defensive team always has two options. Give and take, so give the space that the red team is taking and take some space somewhere else, or contest, which is contest the space or contest the resources that red is trying to take, or that blue is trying to take, sorry. And the most important thing with this, we're going to go into both of them in quite some detail, especially the give and take, because it's a lot more complicated. But the most important thing is that if your team is consistent about being on the same page about which of these options they're going to go for, if you consistently do one of these options together as a team, it is 100% better and more consistent, way better. You're going to be way better than a team that always knows the right reaction, always knows which one to do, but doesn't do it together consistently, right? So the most important thing by far is just making sure your team reacts the same way. So let's talk specifically about what each of these options looks like. So the first option that the defensive team has is to sort of give and take. So let's say this blue team, Makoa, or the blue team in general, is trying to take some space on this right side or bottom side of the map here. They want to take this space from the neutral position. So if blue has this space and red has this space, blue's going to want to make a play up to this right side here, for example. The first option that the red team, the defensive team, has in this situation is just to give that space to blue team, allow them to sort of walk up here and start contesting this space instead, and just take the space on the other side of the map, just give this up, kite away from it, and sort of move towards this space and take this space instead. And this sort of relies on the sort of yin-yang thing I was talking about in the space lecture. So just as a review quickly, in order for you to take space, you need to move your contested space, right? So Mako is contesting this space. If he wants to contest this space over here, he has to move his character, move his contested space up into this area so that it can contest that area. Right, so if Mako moves up here, then his contested space will now be in this area that he wants it to be contesting, but he'll no longer be contesting this space here because he's no longer there, essentially, right? So your space sort of moves with you as you make aggressive plays. And so if we imagine it for sort of a team, right, if the blue team is on this half of the map and the red team's on the other half here, if blue team makes an aggressive play onto the right side here, sort of, you know, there's going to be, you know, some champions here, some champions here. As they make that aggressive play, as they sort of move their characters over to this space more, that means that they're going to be starting to contest this space more, and they're still sort of going to be contesting this space over here, but less so over here, right? Like they're going to start to contest less and less space over the opposite side of the map here as they move towards this area, right? And so you get this sort of movement of space as you go around, which, you know, increases in the area you're moving into and decreases from the area you're moving away from, right? And since red team now has this space more available to them, they can start moving this way more freely. That's sort of the yin-yang of space there. And the same thing can be applied for resources too, right? So as blue team sort of uses resources on this right side here, they can use a lot of resources here. Sort of if all champions or their team in general is focusing on pushing over this right side of the map here, or this bottom side, I guess, from this view, then they're going to have a lot less resources that they can commit up here to this top area, and so they're going to have less of a sort of a presence there, or less ability to contest that space anymore because they don't have the resources. And so it sort of creates this sort of yin-yang of space and resources, where if the red team decides to give and take, they're just gonna, as blue team moves around the map here, they're going to be giving, red team's just going to be giving this space and going the other way, right? Kind of revolves, this kind of looks like a merry-go-round. As blue takes space, red just gives it and sort of rotates away from them into the space that blue is essentially giving them. So if you choose this give and take option to responding to the enemy's aggression, there are things that you lose in the trade and there are things that you gain in the trade. And you can think about these purely in terms of resources if you think of space as a resource. However, for this sort of situation, I think it's easier to think of space and resources a little bit separately. Right, and so the things that you lose in this trade is first the space that they're trying to take, right? Since you're just sort of giving it up, you're going to lose that space and you're going to give it to them. And the resources that you use to disengage from that space, and then as well as any resources that you might use to take space on the other side, although you really shouldn't have to use too many because they're sort of giving that up naturally as they move, right? So if you use resources to disengage from their aggression, obviously those are going to be used up and those are going to be the main ones, but there's also sort of potentially you might use some resources, maybe just like rotational resources, to sort of get to the space that they're giving you as well. So then, similarly, what you gain in this trade is the space that they give up, right? The space that you're taking on the opposite side of the map of their aggression, and their resources they used for taking your space. So you don't really you don't necessarily gain like their resources that they use, but like you gain a resource advantage through the resources that they use for taking your space. So if you pull off this maneuver correctly, there's sort of a couple of like good scenarios or good things that come out of it for you. And the first one is just very basically, they needed to do something, right? It was the neutral game, they were losing points, so they needed to do something, so they tried to take some space, and you didn't really give them much for it, right? Like if you disengage cleanly, you're going to be in a very similar situation unless you give up some like super important space. The mid won't really change, right? You're still going to be at a cap advantage if they didn't really gain anything out of that play. They also used up their resources without changing the state of the fight, right? So not only did if you did it cleanly, the state of the fight didn't really change and you still have the advantage, but you also used up some of their resources and some really important resources that they used aggressive resources. They're resources that were good at taking space. They used them to take that initial space so that they're not going to have them now for the next stage of the fight where they're still going to have to take space because you're still winning the cap, right? So if you do it really effectively, they're going to use their aggressive resources to take space. You're going to give it up. You're still going to be winning the cap. You're still going to be at an advantage. And so they're going to have to keep making plays and make another play. And they're not going to have those resources that they just used for taking space back up yet. And so you have more time and stuff like that to cap the point. And lastly, it also allows you to take space easily because essentially they're giving up some space on some side of the map. So it's pretty easy for you to take that because they're not really contesting it that much. Mind you, this space is the space that they decide to give you. And you have to give up space to get this space. But I mean, it still is space that you're taking sort of freely, although it's probably not the most valuable space. However, on the other side of this, there's also some bad outcomes when it comes to this option of give and take of the space. And one of the main ones is that you can't really do this if the space that they're trying to take will win them the mid, right? So if you're trying to hold some super priority space and they're like, okay, we're going to take it and use some resources, and you decide to kite away, it might change the state of the mid such that you don't actually naturally win the mid anymore. If they hold that position, they might actually start winning that sort of that new neutral game with those new positions, in which case you can't really do this play because then you're just giving up really important space and you're not going to gain any advantage from it. There's also, if you do this wrong or incorrectly, you can get picked in rotation and just lose the fight right there. You know, if you try to rotate away and you don't do it effectively enough and they get a kill off of it, you're essentially trying to run away and not doing it effectively, so you lose the fight without even putting up a fight in the first place, right? You can essentially lose without anything even happening for you. And it's sort of mentioned with the good as well, but the space that you take from them, lastly, is not super important space, right? Like they're giving up that space, so clearly they don't really care about it too much, which means the space that you're taking isn't going to be super valuable. So then, when should you choose this option, right? Looking at the good and the bad, when should you choose the give and take versus the contest, which we'll talk about in a second? And the most obvious one is when you can't win the outright fight, right? So if you're playing champions that sort of want to kite and poke damage and don't really want to just like all in right at once, then you're probably going to be not going to be able to win that fight if you take it head on. And so you're not really going to have an option. You're always going to have to sort of kite and give that space and play the give and take game rather than trying to outright fight it. Also, you should do this when the space that they're taking isn't necessary for you to win the fight, right? So this is the most important one for you to think about. If they're trying to take some space and you evaluate that space, you don't really actually need that space. If you take the space that they're giving you, you're still going to win the sort of neutral mid position, the slow play off of cap poke fight, then you can just give that up and it won't really change the state of the game if you do it correctly. And so it's a really good play for you, right? It'll get you that sort of advantage. And so pretty much anything played at the top level, and Paladins included, is all about compiling very small advantages for yourself one at a time, right? You're never really going to sort of outright win the game right away at a very high competitive level. So the give and take is a perfect place for both teams to sort of get that small little advantage to push them towards winning that fight. And so really the thing you have to think about, or the thing you're trying to get or make sure you get, is that the resources that they use to make their aggressive play plus the space that you are getting must be more valuable to you than the space that you give plus the resources you use to disengage, right? That's sort of like the trade-off, the sort of little advantages that both teams are looking for in this sort of reaction to that aggressive play. And very basically, just if you can win the fight after disengaging, you should disengage. That's sort of like my rule of thumb when it comes to these sort of reactions. So then if it's all about these sort of getting small advantages, and if you should, and if you can win the fight after you disengage, you should disengage, thinking about those things, then, you know, it takes a lot of sort of game knowledge and experience to be able to pull that off in the moment, you know if this is the correct play to do, right? And so there are a couple things that are really important to think about when sort of making these decisions or thinking about these decisions as you go into a game looking at the draft. And the first one is, are they using key resources to make their aggressive play, right? So if you remember in the resources lecture, we highlighted how some resources are really key to team comps, it's especially evident in these sort of games where one team is the very obvious passive reactive comp and the other team is very obviously the aggressive comp. The aggressive comp is going to have some very key resources that they need to take space, and the defensive comp is going to have some very key resources that they have to sort of defend against those aggressive plays and either hold the space or be able to disengage and rotate away, right? And so if a play happens and they're using a bunch of their super important key resources to take that space, and you only use maybe like half of your defensive resources and disengaging resources, you can use only half of them to be able to disengage cleanly, then like that's a great play to make, right? Because then they're not going to have those resources again for their next play. And that sort of goes along with the second thing to think about here, which is like how cleanly can you disengage, right? Can you preserve a lot of your resources, or, you know, how quickly are they going to catch you, right? Things to think about, like, for example, are they taking that space with a BK ult, or are they taking that space with a BK ult boosted by a Grok ult, which is like 20 times faster, right? One is a lot harder to disengage from and one is a lot easier to disengage from, right? If they're just using a normal BK ult, you can probably just sort of like run away from it if you see it early enough or you hear it early enough. You can sort of just rotate away and, you know, walk away from it. But if that's like a Grok BK ult, you're going to have to use something pretty extreme. You might have to use an ultimate to try to disengage from that ult combo, because it's a very good one at sort of catching people out in rotations. And lastly, how important is the space that you're giving versus the space you're getting, right? Like, this is the ultimate sort of thing that you need to think about and thing that's going to decide if this is correct play, right? Remember, it's the right play if you can disengage and still win the fight after, right? And so the most important thing to think about with that is, what space are we giving and what space are we getting? Now, often this really important question is going to be defined by two things. And the first very just basically is your draft. So some champions are just naturally better at sort of kiting away, and some champions are naturally better at standing and fighting. So for example, Cassie and Tyra, right? Cassie's has a role, she has disengaged, she's very good at sort of like kiting people away and falling back, although they're very similar champions, right? Tyra, on the other hand, is much better at like standing and fighting. She's no mobility, but she has like a lot of health, and she can either go to like DR or a firebomb that makes it really hard to push into her, and all these sort of things that makes her really good at her ability to stand and fight. So while they may like sort of fill the same backline DD mid-range role in a team comp, the specific one you choose is going to give you indications as to which your team is better at kiting or contesting. And the other one is probably the most important question or thing you need to think about when deciding whether you should kite or not, and it's, what space are you giving up, right? If that space is super important to you, if it's necessary for you to win the mid, it's not going to be a good decision to give it up, because then you don't really have any position to win the mid anymore. However, if it's not very important, it's more likely that you should give it up. So Serpent Beach is a great example of this, because it's one of the few maps that really only has one super good priority 1 space, and everything else is sort of subpar priority 2 outside of all of here, right? And so on Serpent Beach, teams are much more likely to stand and fight at this position up here than they are to kite away from it, because they don't really have anywhere good to kite to. If you take maps like Shadow Desert or Fish Market, for example, on the other hand, those are very like good kiting maps. Those are sometimes what we call rotational maps, because all of the space around mid is relatively good. You know, there's no like defined priority 1 space, so kiting is very easy and valuable, because you don't really ever have to give up super priority space for you, because no space is particularly better than other space on those maps. Whereas on Serpent Beach here, like you can see, this space is much more valuable than all the other space. So you're much more likely to stand and fight. Now, just lastly, something I want to quickly mention about the give and take option is something that often gets overlooked, and it's your point tank's positioning and playstyle based on how the movement of space changes, right? So a lot of maps are designed in this way, where if both teams split the neutral game just mid like this, the way that point tanks play is they go on point for a while and then they reset back to a position. And in these neutral mid positions, often it's quite easy for the point tanks to go back and reset, right? So if blue has all the space controlled, the point tank only has to walk here or here to be out of LOS of all the red champions, and they're pretty safe, right? That's a very short rotation, very easy rotation, things like that, right? However, as soon as the rotations start happening, the area that the point tank has to move back to remain safe and reset changes depending on how the teams changes, how the space changes. So for example, let's say a blue team comes and takes this space, makes an aggressive play up high ground, and red team just like kites and gives it up and goes over to this area of the map. So then your split looks more like this, with essentially a 90-degree shift in how the space is held. Now, if you look at the angles, while blue may now have both priority 1 spaces, which is generally going to be better for them, it actually makes their main tank's job a little bit harder, right? Because if you look at where their main tank can go now, the red team now has LOS on here because they have this, and here, and here. They sort of have all the old positions that the main tank wanted to go back to. So now the main tank has to fall back like into the team's LOS, and they have to go all the way back to like over here, right? They have to rotate past one wall and then go through a corridor and then go back to get safe over there, or they have to go like all the way out here somewhere, which is also very awkward, right? Like the main tanks, while your team got better space and more good positions for everyone else, your main tank's positioning actually got a little bit harder because they can no longer back out and reset as easily. And so it's just something you have to be aware of, right? Usually you're going to have other advantages that sort of counteract for this. Like if in this example, your DPS should be able to poke point and poke the enemy DPS much more effectively than they can because of the superior positioning that you have. So you do have like that advantage going for you, but you do also have to think about, like, especially if you're a main tank, or if you're relying on sort of this game plan of sitting on point, you have to be very aware that it's a lot easier for your main tank to get picked off in this rotation and sort of ruin your game plan if you rotate in a way that makes it so that it's harder for them to rotate back and get safe and reset their cooldowns. And other maps that are like really important for this are like Frozen Guard, where, you know, jumping up to that window, you don't really have to like climb up those boxes to get to window as a point tank to reset. That's very awkward if you give up like the wall on the right side of the map there. So the second option to responding to an aggressive play is to contest and fight it, right? And this is a lot more simple. It's pretty much just they try to take somewhere and you say no and you fight them for that space, right? So they're going to pour a bunch of resources and everything into try taking space. So let's say this blue team has this half, the red team has this half, and the blue team wants to make an aggressive play onto this right side, same as last time. Instead of just letting this Makoa walk in and kite away, the red team here is going to actually pour their resources into this area and try to stop this Makoa, kill this Makoa, push him backwards, and reclaim this space. So we're going to hold down this space, not let the blue team get control of this space and contest it. And really, the outcome of this really depends on who has better resource matchups, who plays the fight better, has better like micro, gets their resources there faster, all of these things. And generally speaking, this sort of reaction is going to win or lose the fight very quickly, right? So while they're rotating, you know, the fight continues and goes on and on and on until someone finally gets picked. And this blue team tries to take some space, red team contests it, they say no, and one team is just going to win this and win the fight, and there'll be a retake after this, right? It's much quicker, much simpler, although like the actual fight, everything sort of happens at once rather than drawn out where it happens in the give and take. Now, the good and the bad when it comes to the contest is sort of defined by almost like innate advantages that the defense has versus innate advantages that the offense has. And so the good things for the defenders, the people who are deciding to contest it in this situation, is that you generally have the total resource advantage because the aggressive team needs to use resources to initiate that play, and you also, generally speaking, have the positioning advantage. So let's look at an example here. If the red team's trying to make an aggressive play onto the high ground of the blue team here, first the blue team is going to have a resource advantage, and this can very simply be like if this BK is going to ult across these high grounds here, he's going to have to use his health as a resource because Knessa is going to be shooting him as he crosses that space to try to get up to the high ground and contest the Knessa. Pretty much any resources that this red team uses to cross the space, their space-making resources, are going to be used up before the fight. And that's sort of how the blue team has a resource advantage. The blue team here is also going to have the positioning advantage in two ways. So the first is that, generally speaking, and now this isn't always going to happen, but this is often going to happen, is the blue team will have a positioning advantage in that their position is going to be sort of like more reinforced and just like a naturally better position than the red team is going to be. So it's like you can see on Serpent Beach here, if red team wants to contest this space, Knessa, whoever the blue team has up here, like the Knessa, is going to have like corners, they're going to have the high ground, they sort of have this nice space to work with, whereas the red team has to cross this sort of death channel, this really unfun space to play in that nobody really likes to play in. They're going to have to cross this and then play from like the front of this high ground maybe, whereas blue has a lot more like options and they just have like a better space to sort of play from. And the second reason why you generally have a positioning advantage is it's typically easier and quicker to get all of your resources into this fight at once, right? So if in the fight, if red's pushing this and they want to get high ground, that means the fight's going to be won or lost in this area, and so pretty much everyone on both teams is trying to get all of their resources into this area as quickly as possible, right? As quickly and as best as possible. Everyone's going to be looking to get there. So if you look at these two flanks, for example, if the play comes over here, this Koga is going to have an advantage both in just natural LOS from his position. Since he's here, he can like see this high ground a lot better than the Xin can. The Xin can only see like parts of it. It's kind of blocked by certain LOSs. And more importantly, for them to rotate, right, Xin has to rotate through much more space. He has to come all the way over here and then here, whereas the Koga just has to come, you know, over here, right? Koga has a much shorter time crossing this space to get to his team than the Xin will, because you know, they're pushing into the blue team, they're pushing into the Koga's team, into where Koga is playing off of. Now, on the other hand, there are sort of some inherent disadvantages to being the defense in this contest situation. The first of this is that it typically won't be at your optimal range, so the fight won't be taken at your optimal range. If you just think of how team comps work, typically the comps that want to be more aggressive are going to be the ones that have shorter range, and so if you're contesting an area, everyone's going to be, you know, nice and close in it, and you'll sort of have to either like kite away to get to your optimal range, which takes time and resources, or just fight it at a not optimal range. And the second one is that they get to strike first. You know, they're the ones that are setting up the play and making the play, so they get all the initiative, which often means that they can sort of initiate it how they want to. They sort of have the advantage there. So if we take this example again, if the red team is pushing in, the first thing is that it's generally going to be at their optimal range, right? If the BK gets up here and the Knessa is here, BK wins the fight very easily at close range, whereas Knessa wants to be at long range. So Knessa is forced into this awkward option of either trying to fight it at short range, which isn't her optimal range, or by kiting away and then contesting it, which, you know, takes time and resources to rotate over, as well as then, you know, might not have the best LOS on this fight. There's some things that, you know, red team can maybe hide behind and make Knessa less effective. Either way, Knessa is going to be less effective in this fight for the high ground than BK will once BK gets into this position. And the second one is just like they get initiatives. So while I was saying it's an advantage that blue team can often get all of their resources into this fight first, sometimes that's untrue just because of the initiative advantage. You know, Xin knows this play is going to happen, and Koga doesn't, right? So he might position himself in a way, he might stay on his mount maybe, and he might already be sort of sneaking over here before the play starts, so he might actually get there before Koga just because he knows it's going to happen and he can set up for it, whereas Koga can't. So then, thinking about these advantages and disadvantages, when should you choose to contest rather than to give and take to sort of kite away? And very basically, the only time you should choose to contest is when you can win the fight. Right, so that'd be things like when you think they messed up their engage, maybe, you know, they relied on their flank and their off tank coming in at the same time, and your flank got some really good poke on their flank right before they made that aggressive play, so the off tank goes in expecting the follow up, and then they can't follow up on it, so you can sort of, instead of kite away there, you can just fight it because, you know, they made a mistake on their engage. Or if you think that they miscalculated their ability to fight you, you know, they think that they can fight you, but you think they can't, then, you know, it's just going to be a battle of who was right. So then what are the important things when making the decision, or when you have made the decision to fight, is pretty much always going to be around key resources, and especially ultimates when it comes to key resources, right? So what alts do they have up? You know, alt tracking is super important for this, right? decision of can you win the fight is going to be very heavily defined by which ults you think they have up, right? Like whether they have their Ashe ult or don't have their Ashe ult is a super, super important thing for you to know if you're going to choose to fight it, right? That's a big change in how that fight is going to go down. And similarly to that, if you do make the decision to fight, you still need to think about which of your ults are best in this situation, like which of your ults respond to their aggression the best, and how many of them, how are you going to use those, and how many of them do you want to use, right? So this sort of comes down to your ultimate economy, right? If the cap is like 80-0 for you and they're making their aggressive play and it's like 3-3, you know, maybe you can just use all 5 of them at once and try to wipe them and win that fight, because if you win that fight, you win the game. Or maybe, you know, they have all 5 of their ults up and you expect them to use 5, so you're like, okay, you know what, actually we're just going to bait them and we're going to use none of them, and then use all 5 of them to retake and win that way. Instead, we think that will be easier. You know, just thinking about, you know, your ultimate economy. Maybe you want to only use half of them and save the rest for their retake, or, you know, something like that. Now, we've been looking at a pretty basic level of the macro game, so I wanted to quickly go over how you may apply this at a top level. And while I've been sort of separating the offense and defense, like the offensive team and the defensive team, and you might think that's sort of like, or it sort of generally is the proactive team, the team that's going to have to making proactive plays, and the one that's making defensive and reactionary plays. But at a really top level, even the defense has to make proactive plays. They have to be proactive in their defense. They have to sort of expect what's coming from the offense and react to it, or start reacting to it before it even happens, right? So if the offensive team knows that the defense isn't in a position where they can take the fight in the area that they're trying to push, which is, you know, sometimes not that difficult to know, they'll probably try to set up to sort of like pinch or catch someone out in rotation so they don't just like rotate for free. Right, and that's a lot harder to do when the defending team is reacting to the start of the play versus reacting to when the play is going down and when the things are happening. Right, the earlier the defensive team starts to rotate, the easier it is for them to be able to rotate, and the less chance it is for them to get picked. Right, so there's some obvious examples of it that, you know, you can probably do in, you know, any level of play, which is like if a Fury ults, you can use some counter ults like a Mave ult, right? Like if a Fury ults, you know that team is going to be getting aggressive, right? No one just like Fury ults and then sits passively. So you can use, you know, like a Mave ult for something to blind them as they try to go in and make their play a lot less effective, right? You don't have to wait for to see them moving in with the Fury ult. All you have to do is hear this very start of the Fury ult's sound effects or whatever, and you can immediately pop your Mave ult because you know that's coming. Some other like sort of classic examples is often the Mave ult is used more for the aggressive team, so the aggressive team will pop the Mave ult and then everyone will sort of run in, and so you'll see classic counters like as soon as the Mave ult gets popped, even if an Andrew isn't like in a good position to get a good ult off, he will ult just for that CC immunity so he can see again, and because it's a lot harder to push into an ulting Andrew than it is to a normal Andrew. Same thing with Ruckus, you know, Ruckus might be like sitting on top of his support and he'll just pop his ult so that they can't get on top of his support without eating the full Ruckus ult in damage. Right, but these are sort of like obvious examples, like obviously someone Mave's ults or Fury ults, they're probably going to be going in and making an aggressive play, but there's also some like super nuanced and less obvious examples, ones that you really have to be aware of at a top level. For example, if an Ashe starts her dash animation onto a Victor somewhere, like, you know, she's trying to push that Victor out, and the earlier that Victor starts to rotate away from the Ashe, the better it is for him, right? So he shouldn't wait until the Ashe has already dashed into his face to start running away. He shouldn't try to maximize his damage. He should just be running as soon as he sees that dash animation, if his, tank in front of the Ashe isn't going to block it, right? If Ashe is going to get onto him, he needs to be making sure he's getting away as fast as he possibly can. And this can be even like more nuanced, right? If, at a super top level, if your off lane takes a bad trade and has that like low health, a really good team is going to capitalize on that, and they're going to push that, and they're going to start, making an aggressive play. So you'll sometimes see, really good players, use an ultimate where it seems like, it wouldn't be needed, or, nothing's really happened yet. But let's say their off lane took a really bad trade, lost a lot of health. They can sort of use an ultimate just to ensure that that offensive team that was just about to push that can't actually push that. Or, give their offlane space to sort of rotate even when they're low on resources. And the same thing sort of applies to when you choose to stand and fight, the contest option as well. Remember, in contesting, you want to make sure you get pretty much all of your team's resources there as fast as possible, so the earlier reacting to that, the faster you get the resources there, and the better chance you'll have of actually winning that fight. Now, I also wanted to go into a little bit about what the aggressive team needs to be thinking about in these situations. And while it is a lot simpler because they don't really have to make any decisions compared to the defensive team, they sort of just like talk about what play they're going to make and then they go execute it. There are some really common mistakes that are made from the aggressive team. And so the biggest mistake that I see is making an aggressive play into a space that isn't super valuable for your team. And so often in like VODing and things, I hear people say like, oh, you know, we pushed this and we got a kill or we got 2 kills, you know, how do we lose this? And the answer is almost always that sure, you got some kills, but the space that your team committed into was just like so bad that it didn't even matter. And so if you remember from the introduction video to Paladins University, I went over this clip from the NA finals and the regional championships, which is supposed to be like the top tier of Paladins. You can see even like the best teams are making these sort of mistakes. So Yeezy here is playing a double flank comp with Lex and Andro, so generally speaking they're going to have to be the more aggressive one, whereas Snappen's comp is a little more standard. They have the Barrack to sit on point with, you know, like the Knesset to support them. But Snappen also has a way to like punish overextension with their sort of aggressive offlane, and so pretty much the way this game is played is that, you know, Yeezy's going to be making some play somewhere, and Snappen's going to be trying to punish that by sort of having counter aggression somewhere with Eevee and Ruckus. And so this play that I sort of highlighted in the introduction video is a perfect example of this, because you can see Yeezy here with their Lex is going to, you know, they're essentially holding this position. You can see here they're sort of holding around this bridge with their tank below them there. And Ruckus is going to start, you know, taking space on the left side here. So they're going to, this Lex is going to make a play and try to take space in this left side of the map into this little low ground here. By pushing out here and trying to like kill the Ruckus, right? So he's trying to kind of kill the Ruckus, but he's also just trying to sort of control the space. However, this space that he's about to go into here, it just like isn't valuable space at all, because it's not good space. Your team doesn't really want this space, and you'll see why, because it's so like this space leaves you super vulnerable to like every position, right? This high ground up here that Strix is at can easily kill anyone in this space, and the mid that he's shooting Ruckus at, these people can easily just collapse on here. They have a lot more cover and stuff. So this position is really bad. You can see he made an aggressive play into here, and partly his team didn't support it, but partly it's just like an aggressive play into a space that doesn't really matter, and so he's just going to die for free because he's in a really bad position now and didn't really get much out of it. Like, sure, he forced Ruckus out of there, but Ruckus didn't really want to be there in the first place, so it wasn't super valuable. And that's sort of like a very classic, very obvious mistake that happens all the time, especially at top levels, even at top levels, I should say, because often you don't like really evaluate the space that you're pushing into. You just see a champion that you want to kill, and you don't really evaluate, well, this space is actually really bad. Like, I don't actually really want to push into this space, and so you kind of do it anyways, and then you just, you know, die for free like that. More typically, however, and especially at lower level plays, but you see this a lot in high levels of play as well, is not just like going to a space because it's bound like that Lex did to try to like get a poke on a Ruckus, but often you'll see teams committing for kills when they have to commit into a really bad area to get that kill, right? They prioritize getting a kill. People really over-prioritize getting kills over controlling space a lot of the time. And so you'll often see these plays where a team will overcommit to get a kill and then still lose a 45 fight just because their position is so bad. So, for example, if you take this blue team versus red team here, let's say this Ashe was committed up onto this right side, and she got low, and so she falls back and she dashes into like docks here, right? And this blue team is going to over prioritize finishing this Ashe kill, and so often you'll see them like the BK and the Buck, they'll be like, aha, this is a free kill, so they follow with their movement abilities and they go here and they kill this Ashe, and like, sure, they got a kill and they followed up on some aggression, but now even if they kill this Ashe here and they have a man advantage in the fight, their positioning here, if they have no movement abilities and they're here, this is an absolutely awful place to be positioned, right? Especially if red team has maybe another like control of this space here, because this Victor is just going to come over here and he's just going to destroy these people with much better positioning. Like the Victor and Genos can just sort of go together. Genos can just like grip someone around the corner, and Victor kills them for free, and despite them having more people, they're just in such a bad position. Their DPS are in terrible positions, so they're just going to sort of die for free after that. That it doesn't even matter that they got that initial pick, because they just lose. Especially if they can't back into this, if there's, some tank on the point here from red that's blocking this little tunnel in here too. It just, they overcommit to get a kill into a very bad position and lost it. So you'll see this constantly in especially lower levels of competitive play. The second mistake that I constantly see the aggressive team making is around communication. So the first push, the first aggressive maneuver that a team makes is actually really like simple and easy to communicate around and to sort of set up for, right? Like let's say you're at the start of the mid, you sit and spawn for 40 seconds and you talk about how you're going to make your play the next round. You're going to, how you're going to push, let's say it's the red team here, how you're going to push up onto their high ground there. And so that's really simple, right? Like you already talked about it, everyone knows what they're going to do and they do it. What really separates good and bad teams, however, is what they do after that. If the fight isn't just won on that initial play, how can they as a team still move forward together in a good way after that? That's really where communication often breaks down. And so you'll often see this specifically on like Serpent Beach, for example, when they expect teams to like hold high ground. But if this blue team is getting pushed in and they decide to do the give and take and not the contest, the fight is likely still going to happen. If they disengage cleanly, the fight is still going to happen. So let's say blue team starts on their high ground, or red team starts on their high ground, and red team makes their aggressive play onto the blue team's high ground right at the start of the mid. They just int here right off of the bat. And so BK and Zin are going to push up along here. And the blue team has made the decision that, okay, we don't really want to fight this. We don't think we win this fight when they push us in like that. Maybe BK ulted and they're scared of the BK ult. So they're just going to, give and take, right? They're going to say, okay, you can have that. We're going to start rotating over here around this side of the map, and maybe over to like main is a really common one. They sort of back up to main with their DDs and stuff. And what I see constantly happen now is the red team has made the plan to take the high ground, right? That was their initial plan, and so they've gotten their plan, so they're in a good spot. However, now they just lose the fight because they've stopped communicating as a team as to what they're doing, right? So I constantly see this happen is you'll have the red team push all together, and then the most aggressive characters on the red team, or players as the red team, are going to continue pushing. Now that they have the high ground advantage, they're going to try to catch out these blue team people rotating through mid, where it's a relatively dangerous spot. However, the more passive champions, the most passively minded players are going to recognize that, okay, we got both high ground controls. Since this space was so important, we can actually just win the mid slowly and safely now and force them into the position where they have to be aggressive, right? Our aggressive play netted us a point advantage because now their point tank has nowhere safe to run. They can't back out here, and they can't back out here. They have to back away all the way here. So, we're in a good position. We're going to win the mid from here, so they're just going to stay on high ground. And then, red team gets completely split in their decisions, and some go aggressive like the Zin, and some go passive like the BK, and then the Zin just dies because he went in by himself, or only with like his off tank or something. And these people were like looking at point and trying to burn blue's point tank, and so they had completely split focus and just lost because of that, right? So pretty much the main thing that you need to make sure you're doing as the aggressive team is, ideally have contingency plans for what happens if they give and take, although you don't always have time to do that. So make sure that your shot caller, or whoever's calling the shots, or whoever, if your team's doing together, that someone identifies, once you've gotten here and they've fallen back, your initial goal has been completed, right? Like your play is done once you get here. Whether you follow here and make an aggressive play here, or whether you turn on point and play passively here, are another separate decision, right? This is the next decision that you have to make, and you have to make that decision as a team still. It requires the same amount of, not necessarily like planning, but it's the same amount of teamwork as the initial play did. And so if you don't have good communication around that next play, you're just going to lose. And this is something I've constantly seen in even the very top level of Paladins, at least right now, is teams constantly make that first really good aggressive play together, and then they just fall apart after that and all do their own thing. The last thing I wanted to mention about the aggressive team play isn't as much of a mistake that I see, but an assumption that's often made without really being evaluated. So let me paint you a picture because I think it's the easiest way. I think a lot of you have been in a situation where you're playing a team and you've done mids a certain way. Let's say you're this blue team here and you're the Ash and the BK, and for 2 mids in a row you've kind of gone to sorry, wrong color there. You've gone to keep, and you've played out a keep, and red teams avoided that. They don't think they can win that fight, so they've gone to church, and you've just had your lines sort of been like this for most of the game. And so your plan for the 3rd mid then is to make an aggressive play to catch them out, to go to church and kill them with your ultimates. You're gonna run in there with your BK and your Ash ult, and you're gonna try to kill the people that go to church for them. And there's a really, really important assumption, and so that's a play that I constantly see, and that's a plan I constantly hear people making, is their rollout is intended to kill people that are going in a certain area, that have been going to a certain area as the game has been played, right? You're sort of changing your rollout to catch them out and kill them. And there's a super important assumption that's being made when this sort of play is said, right? So you're assuming that this red team is going to do one of 2 things. Either one, they're going to overcommit to this side of the map, to this play, in such a way that they can't disengage from whatever aggressive play you're making, or 2, that they really want this space and they're going to fight it, right? You're essentially assuming that they're not going to be able to just disengage from your play that you're making into church. And those 2 assumptions are not super good assumptions, right? You shouldn't assume that the enemy team is just going to overcommit into church just because they've gone there the last 2 rounds, and you shouldn't assume that this space is super valuable to them and that they really want it, especially in situations like this, right? Because the reason that they're going church isn't because they particularly like church, it's because they recognize that they can't get keep with your comp. If you go keep and they go keep, they're going to lose, right? So why would they just go keep at the start and when they could just go church? They're going to be forced there anyways. And since they're both not really reliable assumptions, this isn't necessarily the best plan, right? If your plan is to go and kill them, there's not actually a lot of times where this really works, especially this specific one with BK ulting into church, which I constantly see on Stone Keep for some reason. Because a good team that goes this red team, if they're good, they're just gonna stay mounted and they're gonna hug this corner for a second. They're gonna get info of where blue team is going and respond to there, right? Because they know that as soon as they see the BK and Ash in church or not in keep, they know exactly what's coming. And so they're just going to rotate over here on their horses while these people dismount to sort of set up their plays, and then blue team has a disadvantageous position in the mid because BK actually wants to be playing from keep and not church, right? And Victor's very happy to play from either one. So just by not overcommitting and by rotating away from an aggressive play blue's making, they've gained a big advantage just because blue has made the super risky, sort of rollout that relies on red making some sort of dumb mistake. Okay, that's it for lecture 3. I really hope you learned something from this lecture. It was a little more advanced, I think, than the other 2 ones, so hopefully if you're a more experienced player, this is where the lectures start to get a little bit more interesting to you. That being said, now that we've done the basic concept, space, and resources, I have a lot of freedom in terms of what topics these lectures can be on. I can pretty much cover anything in competitive Paladins because it's all based on space and resources. So if there's anything you really specifically want to see, feel free to leave a comment down below or contact me somehow, and maybe I can do that video. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.